In the first months of 1941, the Pacific still looked like a calm without memory. Its vast blue surface concealed the pressure rising beneath it, a slow tightening of intentions that few could yet name. Merchant routes moved in their familiar arcs, island garrisons performed their routines, and the great distances between outposts felt like a kind of safety. But in every direction, the quiet was thinning. The Pacific was not at peace. It was only waiting. Across this expanse, Japan's naval air arm held a confidence born from discipline, planning, and a belief in its own momentum. Carrier pilots trained relentlessly, rehearsing strikes with a precision that seemed almost ceremonial. Their aircraft, sleek, fast, and aggressively modern, were the product of a nation preparing for a conflict it viewed as inevitable. From Formosa to the home islands, airfields hummed with the certainty that control of the sky would decide the coming struggle. And in those months before the storm broke, Japan appeared to hold that control effortlessly. By contrast, the American presence scattered across lonely outposts looked improvised, even fragile. On remote islands, Midway, Wake, Palmyra, sat a handful of long-winged flying boats, the PBY Catalina, a machine so slow that a headwind could nearly halt it, so thin-skinned that a burst of rifle fire could tear through its hull. Crews joked that the Catalina took off in installments, lifting piece by piece into the air. They gave it a gentler name, the Cat. To enemy observers, the nickname seemed fitting for other reasons. A cat was an easy catch. Its engines droned at a tempo any fighter pilot could hear long before seeing it. It could not outrun, outclimb, or outfight the aircraft it might meet, and in an age that worshipped speed, its silhouette looked like a relic, a 1930s compromise drifting into a war it was never designed to enter. Yet the Catalina carried something less visible: endurance, a range so vast it blurred the boundaries of maps, the ability to land on open water and linger for hours, a temperament suited not for combat, but for patience. In 1941, this seemed irrelevant. The Pacific was still quiet, the Cat was still underestimated, but war has a way of discovering unexpected uses for forgotten machines. And soon, in the widening shadows across the ocean, the Catalina would find the purpose no one had imagined. Far to the west, new orders were already being written, orders that would pull the Cat into the storm. The Solomon Islands campaign was a contest fought across jungles, reefs, and narrow waterways, where distance was measured not in miles, but in minutes of survival. Airmen who went down over these waters understood that help, if it came at all, would come slowly. Yet among the scattered islands, Kolombangara, New Georgia, Santa Isabel, there was one silhouette they learned to hope for: the long, high-winged shape of a Catalina setting down on a sea that was never safe. In these months, the PBY evolved once again, becoming not only an observer or a hunter, but a rescuer, an aircraft whose endurance became the last thread holding men to life. One of the most daring rescues occurred near Kolombangara, where a group of downed pilots drifted in rafts as Japanese shore batteries scanned the water. The sea was restless, its surface broken by crosswinds that rolled whitecaps into uneven spirals. The surviving pilots watched the horizon anxiously, knowing that the longer they floated, the more predictable their fate became. But then came the low, deliberate hum of radial engines. A Catalina appeared, descending in a long arc that defied both caution and common sense. It had no escort, it had no cover. It was entering a pocket of water bracketed by enemy guns. But still, it came on. As the flying boat touched the waves, the hull struck hard against the chop, sending spray slashing across the cockpit windows. The pilot fought the controls, trying to keep the aircraft level as swells pounded its underside. Enemy shells began to fall, bursting in tall columns of water that rocked the cat from side to side. The crew worked with practiced speed, some scanning the shore for muzzle flashes, others opening hatches and hauling survivors aboard. Those rescued later recalled the surreal calm inside the aircraft, the quiet commands given in low voices, the sense of a machine pushing back against the chaos surrounding it. There were too many survivors and too few seats. Crewmen filled the cabin, the blister turrets, even the narrow walkway along the fuselage. When no room remained inside, additional pilots were told to lie across the wings, gripping tie-down points as the Catalina prepared for takeoff. The aircraft was heavy, overloaded far beyond its intended limits, but the choice was simple: attempt the impossible or leave men behind. The pilot pushed the throttles forward, the engines roared. For long seconds, the Catalina seemed to skim the surface without lifting, dragged down by weight and rough seas. Then the hull broke free, rising slowly, painfully, into the air. This rescue was not unique. Throughout the Solomons, Catalinas earned a reputation for reaching downed crews that no other aircraft could reach. They landed in lagoons surrounded by jungle, on open water swept by storms, and in narrow channels flanked by enemy positions. Their endurance allowed them to search long after faster aircraft had turned back. Their ability to land on water granted them access to places where no runway existed. Over the course of the war, more than 15,000 Allied airmen would owe their lives to Catalina rescue operations. For many, the sight of a PBY's long shadow crossing the waves meant not just rescue, but return. The Japanese, who had once mocked the Catalina as a relic, began to view it differently. Reports described the floating vulture that arrived after battles, circling patiently until it found survivors. Naval observers noted how often the cat appeared where logic said it could not, landing under fire to retrieve men whom the currents were already carrying toward enemy shores. Respect replaced mockery, not admiration, but acknowledgement of a machine that refused to surrender its purpose, even in the face of overwhelming odds. These rescues redefined courage in the Pacific. They were not about speed nor about aggression. They were about endurance, judgment, and a willingness to place the safety of others above one's own. The Catalina's slow ascent from a hostile sea captured a form of bravery that did not announce itself. It simply acted, again and again, until the war's geography shifted around it. And even as the Solomons campaign continued, new demands were forming, missions that would push the Catalina farther north, into waters colder, darker, and more unforgiving than any it had yet known. By April 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, brutal movement. Japan's fleet, once the instrument of expansion, had been reduced to scattered remnants guarding a shrinking perimeter. Yet one ship remained that carried more symbolism than strategic value. Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, a floating assertion of imperial will. Her guns were vast, her armor immense, her scale unmatched. She was the last thunder still held in reserve, and in Tokyo, desperate planners chose to use her in a gesture that bordered on sacrifice. The mission was named Operation Ten-Go. Yamato's orders were stark. She was to sail south with a small escort, reach the invasion beaches near Okinawa, and beach herself deliberately, becoming a stationary fortress, firing until destroyed. It was a plan built on faith rather than feasibility, born from the belief that a single dramatic stroke might slow the inevitable. Before dawn on April 6, 1945, the battleship slipped from Tokuyama's harbor, her funnels shedding a long trail of smoke across the inland sea. Those aboard knew the chances of return were vanishingly small. To the American fleet surrounding Okinawa, the threat was clear but unconfirmed. radio intercepts hinted at a sortie. Submarines waited along likely passages. Aircraft scanned the seas in widening arcs. The question was not whether Yamato would come. It was where she would break into the open water. The ocean was vast, visibility uneven, and the battleships sailed under strict radio silence. The first side to see the other would shape the final confrontation. Once again, the task of discovery fell to an aircraft not designed for battle. From a base on newly captured Okinawa, a single Catalina lifted into the pale morning of April 7th. The sky was washed with thin cloud, the wind unsettled by the seasonal shift. The PBY began its patrol at low altitude, following a sector believed to cover approaching Japanese surface units. Its crew had performed this routine many times, long stretches of emptiness punctuated by the discipline of observation. Yet there was a quiet awareness in the cabin that today's flight might hold more consequence than others. Hours passed without sighting. Then, just after 0800, the radio man leaned forward, staring at a streak on the water's surface. It was faint, irregular, but unmistakable. An oil wake, stretching in a long, dissolving ribbon across the sea. The Catalina turned to follow it, climbing slightly to widen the crew's field of view. Through the morning haze, shapes began to emerge. First small, then immense. There she was, Yamato, accompanied by her escorts, moving south at speed, throwing white water from her bow like a plow cutting through the sea. The crew understood instantly what they had found. Reports began transmitting at once: bearing, speed, composition. The Catalina circled carefully at the edge of visibility, risking detection with each pass. Japanese lookouts spotted the aircraft briefly, but the cat remained just far enough away, its silhouette half lost in cloud and distance. What mattered was not confrontation, but certainty. When the last figure was confirmed, the pilot turned the aircraft back toward Okinawa. Behind them, the battleship continued her steady advance, unaware that her path had already been sealed. The response was immediate. Hundreds of carrier aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, lifted from decks positioned to the south. They fanned across the sky in hunting formation, guided by coordinates from a plane that could not outrun a fighter, yet had outraced time itself. By early afternoon, the first American squadrons reached Yamato's position. The battle that followed was both swift and immense. Bombs struck her decks in rapid succession. Torpedoes tore into her flank, forcing the great ship into a widening list. At 14:23 hours, an explosion split her hull, sending a massive plume skyward. The pride of the Imperial Navy rolled and disappeared beneath the waves. In the aftermath, the strategic implications were clear. Yamato had been unable to reach Okinawa. The last major surface threat to Allied forces in the region had been eliminated. Yet the deeper meaning lay in the path that led to her demise. The most powerful battleship in history had been undone not by an opposing warship, but by a reconnaissance report from an aircraft often dismissed as outdated. The largest vessel ever to sail was found, decisively and conclusively, by one of the slowest still flying. Irony completed its long, quiet circle. A machine designed for patience had ended the mission of a ship built for shock. And as the waves closed over Yamato's hull, the men aboard the Catalina that found her turned toward their next patrol line, unaware that their single sighting had just closed a chapter in naval history. Ahead, the war moved toward its final months, and the Catalina, faithful to its nature, continued watching the sea that still held more stories. By April 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, brutal movement. Japan's fleet, once the instrument of expansion, had been reduced to scattered remnants guarding a shrinking perimeter. Yet one ship remained that carried more symbolism than strategic value. Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, a floating assertion of imperial will. Her guns were vast, her armor immense, her scale unmatched. She was the last thunder still held in reserve, and in Tokyo, desperate planners chose to use her in a gesture that bordered on sacrifice. The mission was named Operation Ten-Go. Yamato's orders were stark. She was to sail south with a small escort, reach the invasion beaches near Okinawa, and beach herself deliberately, becoming a stationary fortress, firing until destroyed. It was a plan built on faith rather than feasibility, born from the belief that a single dramatic stroke might slow the inevitable. Before dawn on April 6, 1945, the battleship slipped from Tokuyama's harbor, her funnels shedding a long trail of smoke across the inland sea. Those aboard knew the chances of return were vanishingly small. To the American fleet surrounding Okinawa, the threat was clear but unconfirmed. Radio intercepts hinted at a sortie. Submarines waited along likely passages. Aircraft scanned the seas in widening arcs. The question was not whether Yamato would come. It was where she would break into the open water. The ocean was vast, visibility uneven, and the battleship sailed under strict radio silence. The first side to see the other would shape the final confrontation. Once again, the task of discovery fell to an aircraft not designed for battle. From a base on newly captured Okinawa, a single Catalina lifted into the pale morning of April 7th. The sky was washed with thin cloud, the wind unsettled by the seasonal shift. The PBY began its patrol at low altitude, following a sector believed to cover approaching Japanese surface units. Its crew had performed this routine many times, long stretches of emptiness punctuated by the discipline of observation. Yet there was a quiet awareness in the cabin that today's flight might hold more consequence than others. Hours passed without sighting. Then, just after 0800, the radio man leaned forward, staring at a streak on the water's surface. It was faint, irregular, but unmistakable. An oil wake, stretching in a long, dissolving ribbon across the sea. The Catalina turned to follow it, climbing slightly to widen the crew's field of view. Through the morning haze, shapes began to emerge. First small, then immense. There she was, Yamato, accompanied by her escorts, moving south at speed, throwing white water from her bow like a plow cutting through the sea. The crew understood instantly what they had found. Reports began transmitting at once: bearing, speed, composition. The Catalina circled carefully at the edge of visibility, risking detection with each pass. Japanese lookouts spotted the aircraft briefly, but the cat remained just far enough away, its silhouette half lost in cloud and distance. What mattered was not confrontation, but certainty. When the last figure was confirmed, the pilot turned the aircraft back toward Okinawa. Behind them, the battleship continued her steady advance, unaware that her path had already been sealed. The response was immediate. Hundreds of carrier aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, lifted from decks positioned to the south. They fanned across the sky in hunting formation, guided by coordinates from a plane that could not outrun a fighter, yet had outraced time itself. By early afternoon, the first American squadrons reached Yamato's position. The battle that followed was both swift and immense. Bombs struck her decks in rapid succession. Torpedoes tore into her flank, forcing the great ship into a widening list. At 14:23 hours, an explosion split her hull, sending a massive plume skyward. The pride of the Imperial Navy rolled and disappeared beneath the waves. In the aftermath, the strategic implications were clear. Yamato had been unable to reach Okinawa. The last major surface threat to Allied forces in the region had been eliminated. Yet the deeper meaning lay in the path that led to her demise. The most powerful battleship in history had been undone not by an opposing warship, but by a reconnaissance report from an aircraft often dismissed as outdated. The largest vessel ever to sail was found, decisively and conclusively, by one of the slowest still flying. Irony completed its long, quiet circle. A machine designed for patience had ended the mission of a ship built for shock, and as the waves closed over Yamato's hull, the men aboard the Catalina that found her turned toward their next patrol line, unaware that their single sighting had just closed a chapter in naval history. Ahead, the war moved toward its final months, and the Catalina, faithful to its nature, continued watching the sea that still held more stories. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world entered a new and uncertain calm. Nations rebuilt borders, repaired economies, and tried to understand what kind of peace could follow a war so vast. Yet even in this reshaped world, some machines found that their purpose had not ended with the conflict. Among them was the Catalina. The same aircraft that had watched fleets, rescued airmen, and mapped battlefields now slipped quietly into a different kind of service, one defined not by combat, but by continuity. In the cold waters off Norway, Catalinas took on the task of hunting submarines in an age when underwater shadows carried new implications. Their long wings and patient engines allowed them to sweep fjords and open sea with the same deliberate precision that had once tracked convoys in the Pacific. Crews listened for echoes, monitored sudden disturbances in the water, and reminded their nations that another kind of vigilance was now required. The Cold War had begun, and endurance, again, proved more valuable than speed. Far to the south, in the quiet reaches of Chile and Argentina, Catalinas flew along coastlines marked by mountains and storms. They served as transport, as patrol, as lifeline. Their hulls settled onto lakes surrounded by peaks, where no airfield could reasonably exist. They carried supplies to isolated villages and evacuated the sick from places accessible only by water. In these roles, the PBY resembled something older than war, a practical tool shaped by geography, meeting needs that technology alone could not erase. Other nations found their own uses. In Canada and Australia, Catalinas became instruments against forest fires. Their pilots skimmed broad lakes, filling their hulls with water before rising again to trace long arcs over burning forests. The sound of a PBY's engines became, for thousands, the first sign that a fire's advance might slow. In Antarctica, their broad wings crossed landscapes of white silence, surveying glaciers and mapping coastlines never seen from the air. The cat's endurance, tested first in war, became a gift in peace. With each passing year, its silhouette became more than a machine, it became a symbol. Broad-winged, unhurried, unmistakable, the Catalina represented a philosophy of aviation that refused to vanish even as jets turned the sky into a place of speed. The same design mocked in 1941, called fragile, outdated, even laughable, was still flying 3 decades later. It outlived many of the fighters that had once chased it. It outlasted the bombers that had overshadowed it. It survived not because it was glamorous, but because it remained useful. Technology raced ahead. New aircraft appeared with sleeker frames and more powerful engines. Yet the cat continued to take off from the surfaces between land and sea, to patrol distances few others could match, to reach places where runways would never be built. Progress could claim superiority, but not permanence. Even innovation, in its ambition, had to acknowledge reliability. The Catalina did not resist change, it simply endured beyond it. By the 1970s, as many nations finally retired their last PBYs, the aircraft slipped into a new chapter: museums, private collections, and small civilian fleets. Yet even in these reduced numbers, it retained an identity forged in years when survival depended on patience. Its broad wings still lifted it into the air with the same steady grace. Its engines still droned with the same familiar rhythm, and its presence still evoked a time when endurance shaped the outcome of a world at war. The cat refused extinction. It had lived through storms of metal and ideology, through peace and tension, through decades of reinvention. And even as its numbers dwindled, the Catalina's story was not finished, for in the memories of those who flew it, and in the aircraft that still carried its legacy, one final truth remained. A machine built for waiting had outweighted history itself. In the long recounting of the Pacific War, analysts often point to industrial capacity, code breaking, and carrier doctrine as the forces that shaped the outcome. Yet beneath these visible pillars lies another, quieter truth, one rooted not in machinery or mathematics, but in perspective. Japan's downfall began not with defeat at sea, nor with the collapse of its logistics, but with a belief so deeply woven into its military culture that few questioned it, the conviction that speed determined worth. They measured strength by velocity, precision, and the brilliance of decisive strikes, but in doing so, they overlooked something far more enduring. This overconfidence was not arrogance in the ordinary sense. It was inherited doctrine, an understanding of warfare shaped by victories in the 1930s and reinforced by the Zero's early supremacy. To Japanese strategists, an aircraft that could not dominate the sky held little value. Endurance was useful, perhaps, but it did not command respect. In their eyes, the Pacific was a stage for swift, offensive action, not for long hours of observation. A slow plane drifting over open water seemed almost an affront to the warrior ethos that prized aggression above all else. Yet war, impartial and unforgiving, tests assumptions. And when the Pacific widened into a conflict of intelligence, supply, and long-range operations, Japan found itself constrained by the very culture it cherished. Its reconnaissance network was thin, its search patterns limited, its doctrine resistant to the idea that an enemy might possess patience equal to their boldness. Japanese commanders depended on secrecy and momentum. They rarely prepared for an adversary who could unravel both simply by watching. On the other side of the ocean, the United States approached the conflict with a different, sometimes unglamorous philosophy. American strategy evolved around persistence, around the belief that wars are decided not only by decisive blows, but by the accumulation of small, consistent advantages. The PBY Catalina became one of those advantages. It was not designed to impress, it was designed to endure. And in a war shaped by distances measured in thousands of miles, endurance became a form of power. The Catalina embodied this quiet strength. Slow, deliberate, and unassuming, it carried no illusions of grandeur. Its crews knew it would never dominate a dogfight or shock an enemy with sheer force. But they also knew something deeper, that the ability to observe continuously, reliably, and at the very edge of range could alter decisions made in distant headquarters. Each sighting, each report, each patient circuit over an empty sea stitched together a picture more valuable than the metal of any single airframe. In time, this truth became impossible to ignore. The Catalina located fleets before they attacked. It tracked convoys that thought themselves hidden. It discovered landing sites, rescue targets, and vulnerabilities unnoticed by faster aircraft. It survived where logic said it should not, outlasting weather, fatigue, and the enemy's growing frustration. It was, in the clearest sense, a weapon of information. And in modern war, information shapes outcomes long before firepower does. This lesson carried a moral weight. The PBY revealed that courage does not always announce itself. Sometimes it takes the form of endurance, the willingness to remain on station long after comfort fades, to report facts even when danger closes in, to hold to a task measured not in minutes, but in miles. It showed that precision is not only the domain of swift aircraft and sharp tactics, it also belongs to those who measure the ocean with patience. Perhaps the sharpest irony lies here. The first to sea decides who will live. The aircraft that Japan mocked, dismissed, and overlooked determined the timing of battles and the placement of fleets. It turned surprise into vulnerability and momentum into miscalculation. It shaped Midway. It shaped rescue operations. It shaped the collapse of the Yamato's final sortie. Strategy was not rewritten by the fastest machine, but by the one that simply refused to stop. And in this, a deeper historical truth emerges. The sharpest eyes in warfare are not always mounted on the most advanced aircraft, nor carried by the most celebrated crews. Sometimes they belong to the plainest silhouette, flying low over a gray horizon, guided by men who understand that patience itself is a form of mastery. The PBY Catalina taught this lesson with every mile it flew. In a conflict defined by movement, it proved that stillness, observation, and persistence could be just as powerful. And long after the war ended, long after new machines filled the sky, the quiet philosophy it embodied remained, an enduring reminder that vision, above all else, shapes destiny. History often recalls the predators of war, the fighters that struck first, the bombers that broke fleets, the ships whose guns announced turning points. Their stories fill museums and monuments, framed by the drama of decisive action. Yet the watchers, the patient sentinels who observed the war's slow unfolding, rarely received the same attention. They worked in the spaces between battles, in the long stretches of ocean where nothing seemed to happen until suddenly everything did. Among these quiet instruments of victory, none watched more faithfully than the Catalina. From its first patrols before Pearl Harbor to its final missions in the weeks after Japan's surrender, the PBY saw the Pacific in a way no other machine could. It witnessed the rise of an enemy confident in speed. It observed the fall of that same enemy when speed could no longer hide its intentions. Its path traced the geography of the war itself. Wake, Rabaul, Midway, Guadalcanal, Okinawa. The Catalina drifted across each chapter with the same steady resolve, gathering fragments of information that would become the architecture of Allied strategy. The Catalina's power lay not in velocity or firepower, but in certainty. It transformed the vastness of the Pacific from an unknowable expanse into a legible map. Each dawn report, each quiet transmission, each careful observation brought shape to a battlefield that defied definition. In a war where decisions hinged on timing, the Cat ensured that timing belonged not to chance, but to knowledge. Slow aircraft can still deliver swift consequences when their vision is clear. Over time, the mockery that once greeted the Catalina, its slowness, its size, its seeming fragility, began to dissolve. Japanese pilots who had laughed at the wallowing flying boat learned that it could find their convoys at impossible distances. Commanders who dismissed it as a relic came to fear the crackle of a radio transmission that revealed their presence. What began as contempt slowly hardened into respect. Not admiration, theirs was an enemy's regard, but recognition of a machine whose endurance challenged their assumptions. By the end of the war, the Catalina had become more than a patrol aircraft. It was a lens through which the Pacific conflict was seen. It rescued the lost, exposed the hidden, and extended the reach of fleets that relied on its eyes to make sense of the movements ahead. In its long hours above the waves, It captured not only coordinates and bearings, but the quiet truth that wars are guided as much by persistence as by force. And when victory finally settled across the ocean, the Pacific itself seemed to acknowledge the machine that had traced its contours for so many years. In the calm water around Japan's surrender, the shadows of Catalina wings stretched across the surface like faint signatures. The aircraft that had once hidden in darkness now moved in open daylight, its mission complete, its legacy unspoken yet unmistakable. The story ends with an irony so sharp it feels almost inevitable. They mocked its slowness once, its age, its unglamorous frame, its lack of speed. But when the war reached its decisive moments, when fleets vanished, when invasions gathered, when the world held its breath, the Catalina found every ship they tried to hide. In the end, the Watchers shaped the war as surely as the warriors, and among them, the Catalina remained the quiet eye of the Pacific, steady and unblinking, long after the last battle had passed into history. In the months before the Pacific ignited, young Japanese fighter pilots sharpened their skills in disciplined arcs across the sky. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M-0, light, responsive, and engineered for the offensive spirit their doctrine demanded. In training exercises, they tested themselves against any aircraft they could find, searching for opponents who could challenge their growing mastery. None of them expected the lumbering American flying boats they occasionally spotted on the horizon to offer even a moment's resistance. When a Catalina appeared, drifting at barely 110 knots, the reaction was almost instinctive. The Zero pilots closed the distance, circled the slow-moving silhouette, and dismissed it with a quiet confidence that bordered on amusement. They watched the cat strain against its own weight, its long wings flexing as though tired from the effort of staying aloft. In these encounters, the pilots saw nothing of danger, only a reminder of how far ahead they believed themselves to be. The Imperial Navy reinforced this certainty. In training films shown to new aviators, the Catalina appeared as a foil, a symbol of foreign backwardness. Narrators spoke with clinical certainty. Easy prey for the Imperial Navy. The message was clear. Against the speed and discipline of Japan's fighter corps, a PBY offered no contest, no honor, and no reason for caution. It was an airframe to be brushed aside on the way to more meaningful targets. The mockery crystallized in written doctrine. Tactical manuals ranked the Catalina below even stationary reconnaissance balloons, describing it as a platform unable to defend itself, unable to flee, and unable to influence the tempo of battle. In a nation that viewed air combat as a test of precision and spirit, the idea of a flying boat hiding in cloud banks or slipping across the horizon seemed almost insulting. Warfare, in their view, demanded bold confrontation. A machine built for patience did not fit the narrative. But war seldom honors assumptions, and the pilots who once laughed at the cat would soon discover that the aircraft they ignored possessed qualities they had never trained to counter. Before the year ended, their disdain would harden into something very different. Just after dawn on 7 December 1941, the sky over Oahu shifted from routine stillness to fire. In the space of minutes, the calm anchorage of Pearl Harbor became a landscape of shock, smoke columns rising, ships heeling, and the sound of metal breaking under sudden force. Among the earliest casualties were the PBY Catalinas moored along the edges of Ford Island. Lined up wingtip to wingtip, they offered no resistance. Within moments they were burning silhouettes, their long hulls cracking as fuel ignited around them. Yet not every cat had been caught at its moorings. Beyond the harbor's reach, a few crews were already on distant patrol, tracing their slow arcs across the Pacific. When the attack began, they were hundreds of miles from the chaos, listening as static-filled transmissions broke the morning routine. These were not combat aircraft. They carried no weapons capable of challenging the fighters sweeping across Oahu. All they could offer was what they had always offered: distance, vigilance, and a view no one else possessed. From the edges of the ocean, they sent back the first fractured warnings, brief signals, scattered by interference, yet unmistakable in their urgency. They reported aircraft bearing the red sun of Japan. They reported shifts in direction, changes in formation, hints of a fleet somewhere beyond the horizon. Their messages were incomplete, but they were the only messages still coming from the sky. And in a moment defined by surprise, even fragments mattered. The crews could do nothing more than watch the storm unfold from afar. Through windows fogged by altitude and early light, they saw only what their training had taught them to notice: the scale of the operation, the precision of its execution, and the unmistakable realization that this attack had not been improvised. It had been anticipated, just not by those who now needed warning the most. For American naval planners, the lesson emerged with painful clarity. Firepower could be destroyed in minutes. Battleships could be caught unready. But information, accurate, timely, long-range information, could shape an entire war. In the ashes of Pearl Harbor, the value of the Catalina changed forever, and far across the Pacific, new missions were already being drawn for the aircraft that had survived. Almost a decade before the Pacific War exposed its value, the Catalina began as a quiet idea sketched in the offices of Consolidated Aircraft. It was 1933, a year when aviation headlines celebrated speed records, new fighters, and the glamour of metal that gleamed under airshow lights. But the engineers in San Diego were working on something very different. They had been asked to design a patrol aircraft, not for show, but for endurance, an airplane whose purpose lay far beyond the horizon, in places that only patience could reach. In a decade shaped by technological ambition, they chose instead to build a machine defined by restraint. The Catalina's foundation was its high, hull-mounted wing, positioned like a sheltering canopy above the fuselage. This configuration was not meant to impress. It was meant to survive. Mounted so high, the wing avoided spray on water takeoffs and allowed the aircraft to land in rougher seas than its rivals. Beneath it, engineers fitted retractable stabilizing floats that swung upward like small folded arms when in flight. They added twin Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines, reliable power plants known less for elegance than for consistency. In the Catalina, consistency was a virtue. Its performance figures revealed the true ambition behind the design. With a range exceeding 2,500 miles, the Catalina could fly nearly twice as far as many contemporary patrol aircraft. At a time when fuel calculations dictated the limits of strategy, this endurance offered a new kind of reach. It meant that a single aircraft could watch thousands of square miles of ocean, trace shipping lanes, or shadow an enemy force long after faster planes had turned for home. It was not glamorous work, but it was necessary. The shape of the hull granted the Catalina another advantage: flexibility. The aircraft could operate from lagoons, river mouths, quiet harbors, or the open sea itself. In remote archipelagos with no airfields, the Cat needed nothing but a sheltered curve of water. This ability turned geography into an ally. A PBY could appear where no aircraft should logically exist, then disappear into the vastness it had just crossed. Pilots who flew the Catalina developed a kind of affection for its temperament. They joked that it flew on patience alone, its slow climb and steady droning pace becoming part of their own internal rhythm. The control inputs were gentle, almost unhurried, as if the aircraft insisted that the world would still be there when it arrived. In an age that strained toward speed, the Cat moved at the tempo of endurance. What emerged from these choices was a paradox. The Catalina lacked armor, speed, and glamour, attributes celebrated in the aviation culture of the 1930s. Yet its simplicity became a form of protection. There were few systems to fail, few delicate components to sabotage, few complexities that the weather could overwhelm, and its slowness, so often mocked, gave it a different kind of stealth. A fast aircraft demands attention. A slow one can slip into places others overlook. By the time war approached, the U.S. Navy found itself in possession of an aircraft unlike any other, a machine built not to outfight an enemy, but to outlast him. A machine that could wait longer than the enemy could hide, and soon, on the far edges of the Pacific, that patience would become a weapon in its own right. In the opening months of 1942, as the Japanese advance pushed deeper into the Pacific, scattered Catalina crews found themselves operating at the very edge of endurance. There were no front lines in their world, only open water, broken chains of islands, and the faint silhouettes of convoys slipping across the horizon. Their task was simple in description and perilous in execution. Follow the enemy long enough to understand his intentions, then live long enough to report them. In these early patrols, the PBY began to reveal the quiet purpose for which it had been designed. From the darkened waters around Wake Island, Catalinas guided embattled marine garrisons, tracing the approach of Japanese fleets that sought to isolate and overwhelm the small outpost. The Cats flew at night, their engines throttled back until the aircraft felt held aloft by will alone. Through gaps in the clouds, they counted escorts, estimated speeds, and marked the pattern of vessels preparing for assault. For men on the island, these reports were a kind of lifeline, brief messages that transformed uncertainty into structure, giving defenders a clearer sense of the storm gathering around them. Farther south, the situation at Rabaul grew darker by the week. The once quiet harbor was becoming a fortress, its runways lengthening, its aircraft multiplying, its defenses tightening into layers. Catalina crews flying out of scattered bases along the Coral Sea studied these changes in measured intervals. They recorded the appearance of new transport columns, the frequency of reconnaissance flights, the rising tempo of activity that hinted at future offensives. Each sortie carried the same risk: discovery by Japanese fighters who held the advantage in speed, altitude, and firepower. Many Cats were intercepted before they could complete their transmissions. Pilots who realized they were trapped tried to gain altitude, not to flee, but to send a final burst of information that might reach a distant receiver. Some messages ended abruptly in static. Others carried just enough detail, bearing, number, heading, to allow American planners to reposition supply ships, reroute convoys, or harden defenses. In these fragments, the Catalina began to prove a simple truth. Knowledge could survive even when aircraft did not. The PBY's weapon was never its guns. It carried depth charges and small bombs, but these were almost incidental. Its real strength lay in the careful stitching of observation across a map too vast for any fleet to survey alone. With each patrol, it pierced the darkness surrounding Japan's advance, revealing patterns and weaknesses hidden beneath the momentum of early victories. The presence of an unseen watcher unsettled an enemy accustomed to dictating the terms of each engagement. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Catalina became something more than a patrol aircraft. It became the Pacific Fleet's nervous system, an unbroken thread connecting scattered commands, isolated garrisons, and task forces operating at the limits of range. Through its long, deliberate flights, the fleet began to sense the shape of the conflict forming ahead, and soon, the intelligence gathered by these quiet sorties would point toward a battle on which the entire direction of the war would turn. In the early phases of the Pacific War, Japan's naval leadership carried a conviction shaped by years of doctrine and an unbroken string of victories. Reconnaissance, in their view, belonged to the margins of warfare. It was a task for auxiliary aircraft or light scouts, useful, perhaps, but far beneath the dignity of fighter pilots who had mastered the art of decisive combat. Information was important, but only insofar as it supported a blow delivered with speed and precision. Endurance, patience, and long surveillance were seen as the habits of slower nations, not the creed of an empire advancing across the ocean. This philosophy grew from experience. In the 1930s, Japanese forces had relied on rapid concentration and sudden strikes to dominate East Asia. Their aircraft operated with an offensive tempo that impressed foreign observers. They believed secrecy, mobility, and surprise could compensate for any gaps in intelligence. A fast-moving fleet, they argued, created its own reconnaissance by forcing the enemy into predictable reactions. The idea that a distant, persistent watcher might track them across the sea felt inconsistent with the very nature of their strategy. As their carrier group spread outward, toward the Marshalls, the Solomons, the Indies, they vanished deliberately into the Pacific, confident that silence followed in their wake. Radio emissions were restricted, movements were choreographed at night. Aircraft flew patrols designed to shield their flanks. For weeks at a time, entire task forces disappeared from view, leaving only educated guesses for American planners to interpret. It was a system optimized for an enemy without long-range eyes. But the Catalina was changing that equation. Each time a Japanese force shifted, whether a convoy reinforcing Rabaul or a carrier group moving to support operations in the Coral Sea, a radio somewhere beyond the horizon began to speak. The first crackle of Morse code was subtle, the message often incomplete, yet behind each transmission lay the same quiet truth. Someone had seen them. At first, Japanese officers dismissed these reports as coincidence. They attributed American readiness to chance. If a submarine appeared in the right place, it was luck. If a garrison prepared for attack too soon, it was caution. Within their worldview, no aircraft as slow as a PBY could patrol the distances required to detect a fleet at range. It challenged assumptions too deeply held to be reconsidered quickly. Pilots echoed the same disbelief. When they encountered a Catalina after days of flying over empty ocean, they treated the sighting as a statistical inevitability, an anomaly rendered harmless by the fragile aircraft beneath them. They engaged the cat with the confidence of hunters interrupting a trespassing boat, certain, unhurried, and unthreatened. If the Catalina transmitted before being destroyed, they blamed timing. If it escaped into cloud or darkness, they blamed weather. Anything was easier than imagining an adversary who had mastered endurance rather than speed. Yet the pattern persisted. No matter how carefully fleets masked their movements, no matter how tightly radio discipline was enforced, the Americans seemed to possess a faint outline of Japanese intentions. The illusion of invisibility began to thin. What Japan's command still called coincidence was already becoming something else, and soon they would discover that the silence behind their fleets was no longer their own. Far to the east, intelligence officers were assembling a picture that would alter the balance of the Pacific. By mid-1942, the Catalina had entered a new phase of its evolution, one not designed in factories or codified in manuals, but shaped instead by the ingenuity of the crews who flew it. They understood that survival required adaptation, and adaptation required darkness. Under the cover of night, the PBY became something almost unrecognizable, a shadow on the water, a whisper in the wind, a patient presence in a war that favored speed. It was here, in the hours without light, that the Catalina earned its reputation as the machine that would not die. To disappear into the Pacific night, crews first changed the aircraft itself. They painted the fuselage in matte black, a finish that swallowed moonlight rather than reflected it. Engine mufflers were added where possible, softening the drone that once announced their presence from miles away. Even the cabin lights were dimmed to the faintest glow, barely enough to read a compass or a worn map. These modifications did not make the Catalina fast, nor did they make it strong, but they allowed it to become unseen, an aircraft that existed only when it chose to reveal itself. The missions grew longer as the war's front expanded. 12-hour arcs became routine, carried out at altitudes so low the wingtips sometimes shivered from the turbulence of their own wake. Pilots flew at wave-top height, trusting instruments that often froze in the cold air, streaming through imperfect seals. Coffee left near a window, rimmed with ice. Watches ran slow. The Pacific, stretched endlessly ahead, felt less like an ocean and more like an unresolved question. Inside the hull, the atmosphere settled into a rhythm of disciplined silence. Crews rotated through their duties with the economy of men who understood that noise, even conversation, brought fatigue. They scanned the horizon through narrow windows, listening to the faint hum of the engines and the soft hiss of the water slipping beneath them. When eyes tired and concentration wavered, another crewman took the seat without a word. In the Catalina's dark interior, the concept of time thinned. Hours blended. The boundary between night and duty dissolved. Danger came quickly when it came at all. Japanese night fighters, increasingly aware that something watched them after sunset, began probing the darkness with searchlights and long, sweeping patrols. When a Catalina was found, the reaction carved itself into the memories of the men who survived. The cat could not outrun an attacker. It could barely climb. But it possessed one last trick, one final defiance. Pilots would angle into the beam of their own searchlights, flooding the sky with blinding white glare. It was a desperate maneuver, so intense that even the crew momentarily lost sight of the world around them. But for a few precious seconds, the pursuer lost sight as well. In that moment of confusion, the Catalina dropped toward the waves and vanished into the dark from which it had come. Survivors struggled to describe the feeling of these flights. Some spoke of stillness, an unnerving quiet broken only by the tremor of their own heartbeat. Others described a sense of suspension, as though the aircraft had stepped outside the war entirely. One pilot, looking back decades later, summed it up with a phrase that spread among veterans. Flying through eternity, it captured the strange duality of their mission, vast danger contained within vast silence, measured by the thinnest margin of endurance. But the importance of these flights did not lie in the stories of those who returned. It lay in what they carried home each dawn. Their reports extended Allied vision another 100 miles, then another, stitching together fragments that allowed commanders to predict enemy movements with increasing clarity. They charted convoys, marked airfield expansions, noted gaps in patrol schedules. They mapped, in slow increments, the ocean's heartbeat. Night after night, the Catalina traced the shape of a war still unfolding, and with each passing week, the darkness it once hid within began revealing a new target, one that would define the next great turning point of the Pacific. On the night of June 2nd, 1942, the Pacific around Midway Atoll lay in a tension so complete it felt almost unnatural. The island's defenders knew that something was coming. Radio decrypts had whispered it, reconnaissance patterns had hinted at it, but the ocean revealed nothing. Waves rolled in from the northwest with their steady rhythm, indifferent to the decisions unfolding thousands of miles away, and above them, Catalinas lifted one by one into the darkness, beginning patrols that would determine the fate of the coming battle. These PBYs, launched from the lagoon at Midway, flew outward into empty sea. Their search arcs stretched hundreds of miles, thin lines drawn across an expanse too large for any fleet to cover fully. The crews expected monotony, long hours of scanning horizons that never changed, broken only by the occasional cloud bank or glint of moonlight on the water. Yet they understood that this quiet was temporary, a prelude to a discovery that could arrive without warning. Their work was not dramatic, but it carried the weight of strategy on its wings. The hours passed, midnight slipped into early morning, and the eastern sky began to pale with the first suggestions of dawn. At 0430 on June 3rd, one Catalina reached the far limit of its search pattern. The crew scanned the ocean ahead, expecting nothing more than the thin glow of sunrise. Instead, the co-pilot noticed lines, dark streaks cutting across the water at an unnatural angle. Wakes, long, parallel wakes, the faint shapes of ships against the morning light. For a moment the men remained silent, tracing the pattern again to be certain. Then recognition struck. They had found them. The Catalina descended slightly, enough to sharpen the silhouettes. Cruisers, transports, escorting vessels in formation, the first elements of the Japanese strike force advancing on the island. The crew understood instantly what this meant. The long-expected assault on Midway was already underway. They had intercepted the approach at the final possible moment. Now they had to survive long enough to report it. Their coded message went out in staccato bursts of Morse. Many enemy planes heading Midway. It was deliberately vague, shaped by brevity codes known to both Midway and Pacific Fleet headquarters. Yet the meaning was unmistakable. The Japanese invasion group had been sighted. Hours before the enemy intended, the veil of secrecy covering their operation had been lifted. That sighting altered the geometry of the battle. On Midway, Marine fighters were warmed and positioned for a direction they had not yet expected. Across the ocean, aboard the U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, course adjustments were made, small changes in heading that carried enormous consequence. What had been a defensive posture shifted into an ambush. The Japanese advance, meant to strike unseen, now carried the weight of exposure. Surprise, the principle that had shaped the opening months of the war, evaporated in a single transmission from a slow patrol aircraft operating at the edge of its endurance. As the morning brightened, further confirmations arrived, yet it was that first Catalina report, sent in the dim light before sunrise, that gave Admiral Nimitz the clarity he needed. The Japanese carriers were not where planners feared they might be. They were where the Catalina said they were, and that difference, the width of a few dozen miles, was enough to set the stage for one of the most decisive ambushes in naval history. Within 48 hours, the outcome was irreversible. American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers as they were rearming and refueling. One after another, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and later Hiryu were struck, burning fiercely across the water. The Empire of Japan lost 4 frontline carriers, many of its most experienced pilots, and the initiative that had defined the early war. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted, not in months or years, but in a single concentrated moment of consequence. And behind that moment stood an unlikely contributor. The slowest aircraft in the battle, painted black for night patrols and powered by engines more familiar than formidable, had delivered the intelligence that reshaped the Pacific War. It had found the fleet when no other aircraft could have reached so far, so early, with such precision. As smoke from the burning carriers drifted across the horizon, another Catalina was already circling above the waves, searching for survivors, searching for certainty, searching for the next faint trace of movement on a sea that was far from done changing. Ahead lay new missions, ones that would push the PBY into roles no designer had imagined. By 1943, the Pacific War had shifted into a contest of endurance, of supply lines, island chains, and the thin threads of night that connected them. It was in this darker phase of the conflict that the Catalina underwent its most dramatic transformation. No longer simply a watcher of distant fleets, it became a hunter in its own right. Repainted in deep matte black from nose to tail, the aircraft absorbed every hint of moonlight, turning its already quiet silhouette into a moving absence. The crews who flew these missions gave themselves a name that suited both their role and their colors, the Black Cats. The repainted Catalinas were not redesigned, they were reimagined. Their purpose widened beyond reconnaissance. They now mined harbors, weaving low across the water to drop explosives in narrow channels used by Japanese transports. They attacked barges strung between islands, striking at the arteries feeding isolated garrisons, and they dropped flares that hung like frozen suns above enemy positions, illuminating coastlines for Allied bombers that followed behind them. These were not the tasks of a fragile patrol plane, but the Black Cats performed them with the same patience that had defined their early war vigilance. Night operations brought a new kind of peril. The Cats often flew so low that their floats nearly brushed the crests of waves. When they released bombs or depth charges, the blasts erupted close enough to rattle the hull and shudder through the fuselage. Crews felt each shockwave as a physical reminder of the thin margin separating their aircraft from the sea beneath it. Yet flying at this height brought its own reward, a cloak of invisibility that radar could not yet reliably pierce. The missions followed a pattern of long, silent approaches. A Black Cat would descend toward a harbor under starlight, throttling back until the engines murmured. Through windows smeared by salt spray, the crew watched for silhouettes, barges, fuel lighters, small transports running supplies to forward positions. Then, with a brief alignment of speed and shadow, the Catalina would strike. The attack rarely lasted more than 30 seconds, but in the darkness those seconds held a precision that belied the aircraft's size. Japanese sailors who survived these encounters struggled to describe their attackers. They wrote reports of aircraft that seemed to materialize from the edge of vision, dropping mines or bombs before fading back into the night. Some described the sound, no more than a muted pulse, then a sudden explosion that shattered the stillness of their anchorage. Others claimed that the planes felt unreal, as though the night itself had taken shape and moved against them. One officer put it plainly, "We were haunted by ghost planes." The psychological impact was profound. The Catalina, once mocked for its slowness, now dictated the rhythm of the night along key supply routes. Barges traveled in tighter groups. Harbors were lit with searchlights that swung frantically at every distant noise. Radar teams called in phantom sightings. The Japanese advance, once defined by confidence, now carried an undercurrent of unease. The night no longer belonged to them. This shift revealed a deeper truth about the Pacific War. Victory favored not only the strongest force, but the force that saw first. The Black Cats extended Allied vision into hours that had once sheltered the enemy. They tracked convoys, marked hidden anchorages, and forced Japanese movements into narrower windows of safety. In doing so, they reshaped the nocturnal battlefield, replacing instinct with intelligence, darkness with data. And as their operations expanded, a new set of missions emerged, ones that required an even more delicate balance of endurance and risk. Somewhere ahead, the Black Cats would be asked to do something no Catalina had been designed for, yet would attempt with the same unwavering resolve.